So, everyone, it's been a year since I began medical transition. Um, that's a lot of medication. Yeah, that's a lot of changing. And not just physical, also emotional, psychological, the works. Also, just the way you think, maybe, as well. I mean, it's really hard to pin down, right? Because I was always someone that was quite emotionally turbulent, but I think that medical transition has allowed me to access those emotions better than I used to, because I used to put on a brave front and it was like trying to live up to this role for so long that was just a facade and not real. Real to others, but not to me. And most people have adjusted pretty well. I haven't had any kind of discrimination or open vilification. I mean, occasionally in online spaces like this one, I get little trolls and I just delete. So that's what I'll do if you respond to this video in that way, because we're not an ideology, okay? This is a deep-seated thing. It emerges, and it did for me from very early years. I was never your kind of boy, you know? Anyone that knew me growing up could see that I was different. Not necessarily understand it in these terms, neither could I until a bit later. But I'm talking about like quite young. You know, strong resistance to being with the boys. Strong resistance to being described as a boy. I mean, it became a bit of a joke because I guess in family environments it's like, duh, you are a boy, right? Yeah, you might not be your typical boy. But it was more than that, and I can't in one video unwrap it all. When people talk about gender identity, I prefer to talk about sex assignment, and that's not just something that happens at birth. It's also something that, like in terms of a reading of someone's body. It's also something that happens actively socially. And every point, if you want to call that sex role or gender socialization, I resisted a lot of that, and sometimes very actively. For example, there was a time kind of in my early teens where my mum, through the church, proposed that both me and my brother went along to Boys Brigade. So you can imagine the kerfuffle that ensued. From memory, I went along for one night, hated it, got rope burn, because they make you do all these sort of like boot camp style things. Hated being around men, hated being around other boys, and then refused to go. Kicked up a real fuss and screamed and shouted, and yeah, like mum backed down. My brother, however, was so content and really embraced it. So there you go. He had a sense of being a boy, and I didn't. And growing up as well, like because we're quite close in age, we'd get called the boys because I've got four older sisters, and I hated that too. And I used to say I'm not one of the boys. I think family will attest to this if anyone's watching this video. I'm not going to talk about traumatic things. I'm just talking about what it is to be on this journey. And it's been a lifelong journey. I think about young people who in Queensland are denied transition care. I thought as a society we'd really evolved from what gender, atypical, and then also trans people narrowly being able to access services like in the 1970s and 80s in Australia could access. I really thought that we went from being a curiosity to just something more accepted, that there just are trans people and that we don't represent a threat, that nothing about of this is about some kind of trend or ideology. The actual ideology that people try to force on us is a gender system that really for most people doesn't line up well. But particularly when you have a different sense of your sexual identity, I wouldn't say gender identity, because gender is relational, it's something that's established through perception, through interaction. It's a form of communication, visual cues. Obviously, it does have some bearing on sex assignment as an active process. So there is a relationship between sex assignment and gender, but gender's wider than that. It's all the cultural constructs that mediate that, and it varies across time and space. It's also intimately linked to institutions and power. Now, some gender critical and radical feminists, by the way, who are not all TERFs, but some are, would argue that that's based on biological realities of women and sex, what they call sex-based oppression. I agree with some of that analysis. I think that some of that's pretty evident, especially when we look at women's the denial of women's autonomy, bodily autonomy and rights to sexual and reproductive justice and decision making. That's a real concern. As well as that so much misogyny is based on loathing of women, including women's bodies, and like sex-based harassment and violence is obviously being coercively brought into a register of gender. Let's talk about gender. As a boy, I don't have all the experiences that someone who is determined from birth and brought up in society and goes through all the processes involved in maturation as a woman has. But it's really a moot point whether everything about sexual identity rests on the biological, or what we understand is the biological, because there's so many components and there are things that we can't even see. There are things that we don't even know about sex differentiation, whether prenatally or postnatally. It's complex. I can't begin to talk about all these things. But as someone from an early age that felt wrong in terms of my sex assignment, all I've done is reaccommodate by whatever means I can. That doesn't mean that I have the same life histories that women who have been through female puberty and from an early age identified as girls and being subject to our misogynistic society in ways that someone assigned male isn't. I recognize there are differences, but I'm also not someone that was evenly or acceptably socialized into being male, because not only is it something that I refused, but also I received gender-based violence on the basis of my self-expression. And actually a lot of that kind of disabled my attempts to transition when I was younger. because not only were there not those frameworks and resources available in the early 1990s, very different picture now, but also like I got like, you know, harassment and violent attacks in public spaces for what we used to call cross living. And, you know, some of that was just me trying out. I hadn't actually been able to access anything like transition care. And having grown up in circumstances of violence and abuse, I didn't want more in my life. It was too much. I was still trying to process all of that. So as a young person, I just thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. But now it's different because it's just undeniable. It's not something you choose. It really isn't. I could go more into that as well. It is not something we choose. It is not an ideology. It is not a pathology. It's a variation. There's some evidence in terms of what's known as bodily schema and the neurological map of that, and how it can conflict with physio morphology. Yeah. And they've done sort of brain response imaging studies about how people identify with morphed images of themselves that are more towards one set of sex characteristics or another. And for people like me, when that morphs onto the sex characteristics associated with being female, the parts of the brain that activate, as for non-trans women, demonstrate a correlation between the neurological wiring and I guess you could call it a form of proprioception. So there's not a specific area in the brain that we can say is sexed, but there is a neurological interface or link between body image and a deep-seated sense of what sex you are. So that's kind of why I want to avoid talking about gender identity, because whilst sex and gender are politically intermeshed in different ways, and even for radical feminists, we need an analysis that understands that, you know, all of the carriage of meanings that come with gender as a system and gender and power, they're also what are part of women's oppression, not just biological sex realities. So we can't abandon gender. The concept of gender is not one that doesn't emerge from varieties of feminism. Some people think John Money invented it, or Harry Benjamin. The question of gender identity is something else. But you see, I don't prescribe to that. I don't think that I have an innate gender identity because gender is social. I consider that I had a wrongful sex assignment. It's different. Does that mean I'm a woman in the sense of women who, you know, XX or have, you know, ovaries and also menstruate and all of the sort of bugbears and commonplaces that get summoned up? Of course not. I don't deny that. But sex is more than that. This could go on as a conversation endlessly, but I just don't really understand why someone like me, who just wants to improve their well-being and their way of feeling, you know, right in their body, needs to be constantly subject to scrutiny when the politics of women's rights and ending gendered violence and gender oppression is really where it's at. And that's kind of what can bring people together for a feminist groundswell. I can't help but see so many of the gender critical and turfist politics as just being all about exactly that space that they feel that they're being denied in a categorization, that they feel that if it is loosened, category woman, that will just demolish women's rights. And that's really not in evidence. We've had decades of, various forms of gender recognition, and none of that has transpired. There is no way that someone like me, the child of my mother who was a feminist, right, poses any risk to women or women's space or wants to take up that space or anything like that. I'm not going to go where I'm not invited or where people feel uncomfortable, just as I wouldn't go somewhere where I feel uncomfortable. Now, there's also the figure of the trans activist that seemed to be an extremist enmeshed in gender ideology. We'll leave that for another time. There are definitely people on multiple sides that engage in aggressive tactics. But I'm not even interested in that. I'm interested in the actual gains for women's rights and to further those and to further anti-violence and also domestic violence and intimate partner violence, redress, and to stop the killing of women, including trans women. So it's just a different politics. It should be allowed to breathe. We should be able to organise from the grassroots without all these fractious, weaponised debates which just distract from the core issues that feminism, for me, has always been about. Anyway, that's enough soapboxing from me. If you're a reasonable person and you can accept difference, then you're not going to go on the attack. If you can accept the terms that I've said as well, that I have no intention of taking someone else's space or political energy, then you'll also potentially engage with me. You might think that what I've described is just delusion or ideology. Who exists outside of ideology? I'll just put that out there. The other thing is, unless you've walked in my, in this case, Doc Martin boots, and lived my life, you don't know, just like I don't know. Yeah? All I know is what I know about how I relate to my own self, my own body. That's the long and short of it. I'm not asking for acceptance. I'm not asking for you to deluge and pile on against me and call me a problem, because I have a productive life as far as I can, right? And I'm an ethical person. I love women. I have 4 sisters. I love my mother. I come from a tradition that maybe is different from yours as well. So this is not a plea for understanding, but it's just to sort of calm down, all of us, and to really think what our priorities are, rather than these endless internecine battles about a category. I don't really see too many women of the global south and brown and black women railing like this. Of course, there are some notable exceptions in the UK. But UK feminism has particular lineages, and they are not delinked from some problematic kinds of links to eugenicism as well. I'll put a few links below. And I'm not saying that all people who activate in gender critical activism and even who declare themselves TERFs are somehow eugenicists. But I do think we have to think about the provenance of our feminisms and to think critically about them, from whence they arise, who they talk to, who they include, including other women, and also what are their real aims. Anyway, this video is really long. It's 20 minutes. I'm going to stop now. I wish you all well. I wish you peace in your own lives. And I don't want us to see, people like me as an enemy, as an embodiment of something monstrous or anything like that. There's a point in which we just have to let be, If you want to call me a man, I don't care. Because that's just counter my own knowledge. And what does it achieve? What does it achieve? I'm not taking anything from you or from anyone if you're an anti-trans activist. I'd also remind you that it's really problematic to align with the right and with people who are and out fascists. We've got to learn some lessons from feminist history as well. That's just me signing off now. And in the spirit of just inquiry and critical thinking, not attacks. And please don't come at me, because it's not pleasant. It's quite horrible actually. So yeah, I don't exist to be pilloried. I exist to be able to have a voice. I don't necessarily speak about these things a whole lot. I write creatively. I teach. I work on the situation of immigrants, refugees as well. Organizing from grassroots. I'm not an enemy. I'm not taking anything from anyone. And also, trans people are just 1% of the population. Let's just get real. Women writ large are 52% of the population. Fight the real enemy.